In this lecture, we're going to talk about one of Aldo's tools that is probably given less consideration from a habitat management standpoint, and that is the gun. Now, what did he mean when he was talking about the gun? Think about that for a minute. Most people assume that he was talking about a trophic cascade, but in reality, we can use the gun in more ways than just that particular indirect effect. So let me be clear right from the beginning what the definition of a trophic cascade is and what the definition more broadly of indirect effects are. Okay, so a trophic cascade by definition is actually a predator having indirect effects on plants by changing the abundance or behavior of the intermediate herbivore. Okay, so think about that for a minute. Specifically, that interaction is characterizing the indirect effect generated by a predator on plants by manipulating the herbivore. Okay, there are all kinds of other indirect effects that could happen in systems that don't include predators or herbivores or plants, for that matter. And when I'm saying indirect effect, I'm talking about any set of interactions in a food web where one species affects another by through a third party. Okay, so you could have snails are affecting uh, microorganisms by affecting the growth rate of trees. Okay, so that would be an indirect effect. There are all kinds of indirect effects. We'll talk about some of them. Most people get confused when they're talking about a trophic cascade, or they say trophic cascade when they actually mean indirect effect. So trophic cascade is just one particular type of indirect effect. All right, so let's go right into this. Now, obviously, the gun can affect the abundance of animals, in this case herbivores. This is showing you the decline of a bunch of species that were targeted during the market hunting that you've learned about in wildlife ecology and management. And you can see the total number of deer plummeted to near zero for these species. It's pretty hard to believe that whitetails at the turn of the century were almost extinct. That's pretty crazy to think about. Uh, you learned about all the legislation and the actions that we took to correct that, but this is a pretty dramatic example of how we could really change the way that plant communities are functioning with the gun. Now, of course, this is market hunting, which led to the regulated hunting that we have today. But this is a trope. If we use the gun to cause a decline in density, which then released plants from herbivory, and we got some desirable plant community condition from that. That in that case, that would be a density mediated trophic cascade. We would be the predator, deer, whitetails, mule deer, blacktails. In this case, would be the herbivores, and then of course all the plants that were responding to that. That response would be the density mediated trophic cascade. By the way, this picture is really kind of astonishing to show you the scale of that market hunting. Those are actually bison skulls, which is, immediately shocking to me to look at the scale at which this kind of stuff was going on. It's no wonder that we had so many species by 1900 on the brink of extinction. It was because there was a market for, these different meats and different wildlife derived resources. So, most people, when they think about using the gun, they think about a trophic cascade where you have this herbivore in the intermediate, and they pretty well exclusively think about it being density mediated, like I just told you. However, there are other ways that this could happen, right? By the way, this picture is from a Pennsylvania experiment showing you how dramatic the deer population or deer herbivory is affecting plant community structure. You can see on one side there are no deer, and on the other side deer are abundant, and it has had a pretty dramatic effect. And that has actually caused a series of other indirect effects. So that's a, this, if a predator was causing this difference, that would be a trophic cascade through the herbivore to the plants. But they've shown other indirect effects in the system, like the earthworm communities are different, and soil nutrient cycling, and all kinds of things about the function of this system have changed strictly as an artifact of changing the density of deer. So pretty remarkable to think about that. It's really cool how that works. So this can happen naturally as well, and what you're looking at is an example of this with deer. Hemorrhagic disease is the most important disease in deer, and in some cases when you have an outbreak it can kill large proportions of the deer herd within a short amount of time. Usually in one season you could see a really steep decline in deer herds. This actually happened during my master's in Tennessee. It was one of the worst outbreaks ever recorded in that state during that year, and I think it was something like 60% of the deer herd in some of the areas died from this. So most people would be tempted to call this a disease-mediated trophic cascade because the disease infects deer, deer die off, and the lower density of deer releases plants from herbivory, and that effect people would call a disease-mediated indirect effect, or a disease-mediated trophic cascade. You can see I even stumbled on it because the trophic cascade in this case is technically not accurate, right? This is a disease-mediated indirect effect. It just happens to be very similar to the trophic cascade because it has deer as an intermediary and plants being affected indirectly. But this is an indirect effect in this case. So hopefully that's clear at this point. Okay, so I'm not sure if any of you are hunters or have been hunting or duck hunting in particular, but as someone who has been hunting, it becomes fairly obvious what happens in situations like this. So ducks are a really good example of developing a behavioral aversion to hunting and hunting blinds and decoys. And what happens after they're moving down the flyway and they've been hunted, the ducks that aren't killed actually they behaviorally avoid areas. They learn how to recognize all these different things associated with hunting. So that is a behaviorally mediated cascade in this case. If hunting resulted in a change in the behavior of the intermediate and that affected plants, then that would be a behaviorally mediated trophic cascade, or a behaviorally mediated indirect effect, depending on whether or not it's a predator herbivore plant or not. So one thing you may not have noticed, but I wanted to make it clear, when we're looking at Elmer Flood with the bunny here, notice in this case we have a broken line between Elmer and the bunny, right? Bugs Bunny. So traditionally in ecology we would treat a solid line like the bunny to the plant. That would be a direct effect, and we treat a broken line like this as an indirect effect. In this case, Elmer doesn't actually kill the animal to then affect plants indirectly, and we think of that as an indirect relationship between Elmer and Bugs Bunny. And in this case, it's signifying that it's a non-consumptive effect. All right, so the change in behavior of the animal to the predation risk is a non-consumptive effect of predation risk. And that non-consumptive effect can have cascading effects to the plant community in this case, or cascade to affect other things through indirect effects in the food web. So that I just wanted you to be clear on, what these things mean, and now let's walk through some of them. So, if you had to guess, do you think this direct effect on the density of the animal, so this consumptive effect, has a greater effect on the plant community, or greater indirect effects in the food web, or do you think the non-consumptive effects uh, have a bigger effect? What do you think? They are not equal, I can tell you that. Which one do you think is bigger? If you said the indirect or the non-consumptive effects, you would be correct. So think about it this way. We pretty commonly structure our hunting seasons, for instance, to only crop off, a proportion of the animal so that it's sustainable. In nature, when predators, are affecting prey, they actually, in most cases, do not eat most of the animals, right? So the majority of animals that are still interacting in the community that they are in, the majority of animals in that population are actually interacting with this behavioral change. So most of the animals don't die to predation, in other words. And there have been some really cool experiments demonstrating this effect. So the one that uh, really made this clear to me so that I would never forget it. There was this really awesome experiment where they had these tanks, and I can't remember. I was trying to think of what the organism was called that they were using as the model organism, and I can't recall what it is. But they had a population of this prey species in these tanks, and there was this predatory aquatic insect that was the predator of them, and they basically did an experiment, and it was really, really well replicated and very well done. But they measured the population dynamics of the prey without any predator, and then they had a treatment where the predator was present and could eat all of the prey, and then they had a third treatment where the predatory insect was present in the water, so that it could try to eat the prey, and they were afraid of it, but they had glued the mouth parts shut on it so that it couldn't actually eat anything. And they ran this experiment, and they came up with about 70% of the total effects of the predator on the population were strictly from scaring them. All right, so the predator just being present and scaring the prey and altering its physiology and the way that it interacted with its resources and everything. 70% of the net effects of that predation were on the population were those indirect or non-consumptive effects. Pretty crazy. This has become a really popular theme in ecology, and I'm just showing you some of the titles that you see where we've been studying this quite a bit. Here was a pretty cool paper with deer showing that when a predator was present, deer spend a lot more of their time vigilant, looking around for to protect from the predator. So we actually see the individual literally forages less of its time and intakes less food. That's kind of similar to that density effect, right? We have the same number of deer, but if all the deer are eating less per individual, that could still generate those effects on plant communities, similar to the density change. We also have had some really cool experiments. This one was with feral cats, showing that cat presence was altering the activity pattern of the species. We can see shifts in habitat use from prey, where they're avoiding predation risk, and that causes them to forage or spend their time in other areas that they wouldn't have if there wasn't predation risk. There's a number of different things. Here's one YouTube video that's pretty cool. You're probably familiar with the Yellowstone example. There's lots of cool examples out there where they show that predation has this keystone level process, is a keystone level process that affects the way that ecosystems are functioning. And we typically, when we have that insect predation at the top, we typically see a higher diversity and a more developed ecosystem services provided in those systems. One of the really cool ways that we measure this, has anybody ever seen one of these experiments? This is actually called a giving up density experiment, and it's really cool because the way that these are set up is supposed to be, but basically look at the sand right here. It's a substrate, and you will put seeds in it or whatever. That depends on what you're measuring, but a lot of times we do it with small mammals. You'd put seeds in that substrate, and the animal would come to dig, and as they eat seeds, they're depleting the resource, which makes it harder to find the more seeds. So at some point, it'll become harder to find the seeds than it is worthwhile for them to stay there. So the idea is that we could measure that giving up density. So at what point do they leave the patch to go forage elsewhere? And if we do that under different levels of risk, they should leave the patch much quicker under risk, because of that would be the influence of risk. So we could actually measure how risky the a particular place is perceived by the animal. So you can see this top left picture. This is a classic experimental design. It's been done with small mammals, where we might look at the value of cover, overhead cover, or something like that. I think in that particular experiment, they were looking at how cover was interacting with moonlight to affect giving up density. One of the problems with this is that it's assumed that the animal's physiological need or demand or desire for particular nutrients is not changing as you increase risk. And you can see this paper, I was an author on it, that was kind of pointing out that this is a confounding effect on this giving up density, and it actually is a foundational issue with that method that we've been using for a while. So why does that happen? Well, this actually even happens in humans. When you have a really highly stressful event, like if you had post-traumatic stress syndrome, a lot of people have that from wartime or traumatic experiences in the life. But the same thing could happen in animals if they are under chronically high stress from predation risk. Essentially, physiologically, the animal starts to value carbohydrates more. And again, this happens in humans as well. It's one of the things that's been documented several times in the literature, that people who have post-traumatic stress tend to value carbohydrates, and in some cases that could lead to other health issues associated with that. But the broader point for you is this is another non-consumptive effect of predation, and obviously it could have a big effect on plant communities if it's changing how animals are interacting with the plants. So if deer, for instance, change which plants they wanted to choose, that could have really dramatic effects. That actually has been documented, and this is the initial experiment that showed it in an old field community with spiders and grasshoppers. And essentially what they show in this experiment is really elegant, and there's been a whole bunch of experiments like this since that have demonstrated similar things. This grasshopper is predated by a particular spider species, and they showed in the old field, basically when the grasshopper has high risk from the spiders, they will switch from a protein-rich food to a carbohydrate-rich food, and that changes the selection in the plant communities. That has a non-consumptive mediated trophic cascade on the plant community, and you actually see dominance shift in the plants because of the shift in preference for particular plant species by the grasshoppers. Now that seems pretty incredible to me, but I've seen I've read into this quite a bit, and there are actually some instances where we've seen other kinds of indirect effects, like some cases where the large vertebrate herbivores have been extirpated or died off, and we'll actually see the grasshopper population increase in abundance and fulfill that same herbivory niche. Yeah, and there have been several times that people have estimated the amount of biomass that's being removed in a system by grasshoppers versus your vertebrate herbivores, and it actually is usually comparable or even dominated by the insect community, which to me is just incredible. It's hard to believe, but these little guys are so abundant that they are removing, similar or more biomass than the large herbivores in many systems. So in this particular experiment, one of the things that was really amazing about it is it was affecting the detritus pool and the quality of leaf litter going in, and they could track it all the way through, these non-consumptive indirect effects where they could track it all the way through nutrient cycling, and so it wasn't just a community function part, it was actually at the ecosystem process level that this was affecting things. So pretty wild to think about, and exciting from a research standpoint to understand, how complex nature is and how all of these things are interacting. And a lot of those things we haven't even been thinking about at the level. So this same group did an experiment where they looked at the plants dominating all of these old fields across the northeastern United States, and they could actually predict whether or not the spider was present in a particular field based on which plants were dominant in the community. So they could even at a landscape scale see differences in community structure that were arising from this indirect effect. This has been shown in a whole bunch of other systems, and this one is particularly interesting as well to me. This was a behavioral mediated trophic cascade where the predators were affecting impala habitat use, and because they were concentrating their activity in some parts, we actually saw the thorn size on bushes in those areas increase, and they actually in the risky areas decreased. And basically we were literally seeing the predator affecting thorn size indirectly through these behaviorally mediated trophic cascades. Really cool stuff. Here's another example from acacia, and it's pretty amazing that acacia bushes, they can respond to the herbivory really quickly. There's also some documented that the longer thorns promote a cavity for I can't think of the ant species name, but an ant that colonizes it. That ant will then defend the plant from enemies. So this indirect relationship where the plant and the ant are benefiting from the relationship. Well, in cases where herbivory drops to a level that the thorns start to shrink, that will actually provoke the ants into simulating herbivory on the plant so that the thorn size is maintained, which is really cool. Just thinking about all these interactions that are going on and really structuring the way that things function. But trying to understand all of these things only allows us to expand upon it from a conservation standpoint to utilize some of these processes in habitat management. We already do that, actually. We've taken the principles of these non-consumptive effects having cascading of, cascading to plant communities. We've already done this. This is a scarecrow, and the idea is to scare things away that are going to eat our crops, right? So we're literally trying to cause a behavioral shift in the intermediate animals that would be attacking our crops otherwise. So we're literally, mobilizing that idea, and we have for a long time. Here are some other really cool papers that are awesome to read. I highly suggest you go and look some of these up, where we're trying to use these concepts to design management strategies. Like this hunting for fear was one of that I thought was really cool, where they were basically showing that we could design hunting programs with in places that we couldn't necessarily harvest animals, but we could design it to invoke the same fear to protect sensitive plant communities or sensitive areas from the effects of herbivory. So really cool stuff that we can mobilize, and hopefully you appreciate how the gun could be used. And this is an emerging area in science, and I'm sure that as we continue forward, we're probably going to learn more and more ways to manipulate fear, to use that as a management strategy. And for habitat management, we already are using the density mediated at great lengths, where we either are using hunting or in some cases sharpshooting to manage densities. We could go further than that and start using behavioral changes or other non-consumptive effects as well. So pretty cool stuff.